Time is just gone 9:23 a.m. as we continue with the broadcast this morning. Now, what we can expect over the next 45 minutes or so is still take a look at Africa Muslims Agency highlighting the Afghan earthquake with Hafiz Hassan Junara. We will be talking with Ahmed Muhammad, a fourth year medical student at the University in KwaZulu Natal. The student response to the possible conversion of the Jamaat Khana to a multi faith prayer room. And next up, we've got an interview that we had recorded earlier on, and this was with Gabriela Chavez, who is an economist. Now, this comes against the election of the president of Brazil, President Lula, and what we can expect. So we're going to play out that interview for the next few minutes, and thereafter we'll be joined by Hafiz Hassan Chunara from Africa Muslims Agency.
We continue with the show this morning and looking ahead at Brazil. Now, there is a huge interest in Brazil with the election of President-elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And knowing Brazil as to where it is at this point in time, Brazil very much of interest to South Africa being part of BRICS and also in terms of the economy of Brazil. Now, we know that Brazil for a very, very long time has been a country that has a huge problem with regard to the poverty and the economy, and the radar is on President Lulu or Lula, for want of a better term, to turn this economy around. Now, this can be done with having the right teams, the right people, and we know that he is expected to announce his economic team in the coming days. And we are now joined by Gabriela Chavez, who is an economist, to try and put this discussion into perspective. Gabriela, Gabby, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share about what we are living here in Brazil.
Well, clearly, as I mentioned, there is a huge interest from South Africa with regard to Brazil and being part of BRICS, where there is a lot of cooperation from an economic perspective as well. So, in more ways than one, we are keeping a close eye on the developments in Brazil, the political developments, and also President-elect President Lula. Now, looking at speculations, and I know that many would be speculating as to what is going to play out in Brazil, what is President Lula going to do, who is going to be the team behind him, and you being an economist, I'm sure a huge interest in who is in line for the finance minister's position in Brazil, Gabby.
Yeah, after Lula's election, like the election itself was very, very complicated because the country was afraid that Bolsonaro would not accept the results of the elections. So after the elections, Bolsonaro spent almost 1 week in silence, and everybody was afraid of what response if he would accept the elections results. Unfortunately, he accepted. In the next week of the elections, all of his team said they will agree and they will help with the government transition. After Lula's election, we have good responses of the market. Like we struggle a lot with this speculative capital, but after the elections, we had an increasing of 1.9 billion in the first session after the second round, and we can see that the external capital it was the biggest applying and coming to our country. On the 10th of November, Lula he made a public speech saying that to fight against poverty will be his first goal to achieve. And he's saying something that is not a surprise. With everyone that voted for Lula voted in a hope that we can reverse these moment of inequality that we are living. The inequality increased a lot in Brazil these last 6, 8 years. After Dilma's impeachment, we can see the increasing of inequality in Brazil. The inflation is coming up, the inequality is coming up, the unemployment is going down, and we people vote for Lula to stop this situation. So on 10 November, Lula spoke publicly that his first priority was to fight against hunger. And the market started start to scream and fight against this, because we are here in Brazil living this dilemma of um, the finances of the government. And what Lula says is that the market gets nervous for nothing. And because he this same market did not complain when we had 700,000 of people dying because of COVID. This same market, they didn't complain when Brazil came back to the world map of hunger. So this market started to complain when Lula said that he was going to put all the efforts to fight against hunger, because it is basically a very speculative market. When we see the data, we can see that this movement of complaint was, in first place, a movement of the internal market. And the internal market start to fall a lot, but the external market, they invested more than 2.2 billion in the next day after Lula's speech. So um, we can see that the public policy cannot regulate the financial markets, and this is the point. When Lula comes to the public to say to fight against hunger, to fight for the poor, to govern and to look for the poorest people in this country is a priority. And he's establishing the policy that we can expect for next 4 years that we have ahead. Lula started his teams for transitions, and we can see that he's confirming his promise to make his team more diverse. So you can see now he's creating again some ministers that some ministers that were destroyed by Bolsonaro. For example, the Minister for Racial Equality in the country and the Minister for Women. Bolsonaro just destroyed these ministers, and Lula is rebuilding it again. And his biggest challenge is the fiscal balance. And since 2016, we have running this fiscal sponsorship law that says that the government cannot spend more than the inflation of the last year. But we have social issues that needs our attention. For example, our conditional cash transfer programs. Brazil was an example on how to create these programs and reduce the social inequality through a big system of policies that was not only based on the conditional cash transfer programs. So the challenge is big, but now we have hope that we have at least a democratic space to fight for these rights, because on Bolsonaro governments we didn't have. So now, it's important to say that Lula made a very big coalition to be able to elect himself. So he made partnership with the center, with the far left, with the left, and with the center right. So now is the moment that he needs to put on the table all these agreements and organize this government for the next 4 years.
Yes, and it is also important to understand that when you inherit the mess from a previous government, sometimes it's not easy. And looking at Lula himself, the background that he's come from, we've seen in the COP27 summit that took place recently, he was like a superstar actually, and he was actually welcomed. And I'm sure, from his background, he understands poverty. He understands what people are actually going through. So he's basically in touch with what the people are experiencing. And it's just so important that the team he has behind him shares exactly the same value system. They share exactly the same understanding, so that they can obviously take the country forward. And at some point in time, find somewhat of a balance in the economy, where on the one hand, you're satisfying the needs of the population, but also on the other hand, looking at the economy as a whole, that can actually take the country forward.
Exactly. Lula he addressed most of our biggest agendas. He is concerned about these issues. On Bolsonaro governments, we had the increase of inequality, we had the increase of unemployment, we had the increase of the destruction of our forests. So he was a very, very negligent president, and it made a lot of um, consequence into Brazil's international relations. So Lula is represents now the possibility to bring Brazil to the agenda of the fighting against these issues. We see now that we have the true possibility to come back to the debate on climate changing, because now we can have a voice. The last president was very aligned to the worst part of agribusiness in this country, and Lula now is trying to find on how can we develop this country, but also how we can distribute the weight around society, because it's not only about to grow. How you grow, it matters. How the inequality grows in this process, it matters. And also, how can the development agenda be in line with the climate changing agenda? So we see now the opportunity of discussing because we have a space, a democratic space, where we can bring the indigenous movement, for example, for this conversation. Lula of the indigenous and the original um, the founders of our society. So we will have the chance for the first time in history to have the indigenous movement on the table to discuss climate changing, to discuss inequality. We are we have a lot of hope at this time, but we also are concerned because with Bolsonaro, the extreme right increased a lot in Brazil. So now we see the presence of Nazist movement, fascist movement, and the extreme right grew a lot, especially in the Congress. So now Lula has a chance Congress, because Bolsonaro left a lot of his seeds in in the Congress, and Lula needs to make a government with this Congress. So it's important that now we have again a democratic space where people can go for the streets and demand for what they want. And we have this democratic space where we can speak. Because in the last government, we were struggling a lot, even with the power of speech. It's important to remember that we had the murder of Marielle Franco, which was um, a senator and a black woman that was very important for the speech of the favelas, for the speech for black women, and she was murdered. So now we have the opportunity to have the free speech again. We have the opportunity to fight against against this inequality and etc.
Yes, and just very quickly, I know we are running out of time. The name Arthur Lira seems to be featuring very, very prominently. What is this relationship between Lula and Arthur Lira?
Yeah, Arthur Lira, he was a supporter of Bolsonaro. He's not from left. He's a right um, representative, and he's the chief of the Congress now. And it shows the how Lula needs to have a very high Lula needs to have ability of negotiation with a lot of parts of society, because Artulita now is in the command of the Congress. He was supporting Bolsonaro at the first time, but when Lula won the election, he recognized the results of the elections. And now, well, when Lula and PT decided last week to support our two leaders' re-elections, they are trying to avoid a mistake that was made in 2014, because when they find very straight against this part of the society, they started a silent war where it finished with the Dilma impeachment. So Lula is negotiating with these leaderships in order to try to build another space, a space where they can talk, they can negotiate. He's afraid that without Artulita's support, he won't have a field for govern. You understand me? Without leader support, it's gonna be very hard for him to approve anything in the Congress, because we in these like last elections, we have a lot of conservatives Congress persons elected. So Lula needs to have now a huge power of negotiation to be able to deal with the right, especially in the center right, because if he doesn't, there is a chance of him to pass through an impeachment or something like this. So it's a case of negotiation what he's doing now with this leadership of Atolida. It's very, very, very. It's a dangerous space, but it's how politics works here.
Well, Gabriela, I must say thank you very much for that and for taking time out and talking to us here on Salam Media, for sharing what you have. And I'm sure we will at some point in time touch base, because things could get very, very interesting in Brazil. And from time to time, we need to talk to someone from your part of the world. So hopefully we will be in touch with you sometime in the future. But for now, we thank you for your time. We wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your work, and I'll be available anytime you need. Thank you very much. It's very important to connect our experiences around South Africa, around Brazil. We have a lot to share. Thank you.
Well, certainly, and obviously we share with you the Brazil Football Club, and hopefully they will be winning the World Cup as well.
Yeah.
Well, Gabriela Chavez with us this morning, and with that, we're going to go for a break. We'll be back.